Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Rob Robinson with Philosophy from the Frontline. This is episode number 44. I have Ray Kimball on today. He's going to tell us his backstory. Interesting how it works. And I say this all the time, your network matters. And he's actually a fan of the As for Football podcast, and he's in our Firsty Club, which is our exclusive Patreon level of folks that we chat with during the games. And after listening to Dan's interview last week, he was like, "Hey, I'd love to be on your show, talk about what I'm doing." And again, he's a veteran that's transitioned, has some interesting stories. So we'll pause there, pass it over to Ray, and tell us what your background is and how you ended up doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm super excited to do this. Commissioned out of West Point in '95, served as an Army aviator for 12 years. Was a line pilot and a maintenance test pilot in the OH-58D Kiowa Warrior. I know there's some folks out there with fond memories of the KW in their heart. I certainly share that. I miss flying. I miss that aircraft, but all good things must come to an end. And so after I stopped flying, I moved over into Functional Area 59, now known as the Army Strategist Functional Area, and did 8 amazing years there. Doing national and theater level policy work, just an incredible job, incredible series of jobs, great opportunities. And then was fortunate enough to be selected as an academy professor back at West Point. Had 2 main jobs in that field, both as part of the dean's staff. Had the honor of running the Center for Junior Officers, which is a tiny little leadership center there at West Point. Used to run, for folks who may remember, the old companycommand.army.mil and platoonleader.army.mil online forums. CJU used to run those forums. It has now kind of branched out into a broad array of leader development activities, podcasts, on different online leadership elements. And so running that center was just a dream come true and an absolute fantastic time. And then branching from that, the dean asked me to set up an organization called Flickr, Faculty Learning, Innovation, Collaboration, and Research, basically kind of a one-stop shop at West Point for all things faculty development that were larger than what one department could handle, right? Because departments are the primary faculty developers at West Point, but there are some things that are really beyond the scope of one department. So as the chief of faculty development, I had my fingers in a lot of different pies, and really my job was just to make sure that the world-class faculty there at West Point had every possible opportunity to develop themselves and improve themselves in the furtherance of West Point's mission. And I ultimately retired in September of 2021.
Oh, it's an interesting story. So a couple points that I'll point out to. One is don't be afraid to switch branches, right? And I think a lot of people, a lot of folks going to West Point think, hey, I'm going to be an infantryman or an armor guy or artillery or whatever branch that respectively they initially branch. And they don't realize that there is a whole slew of functional areas out there that can broaden you, number one, as a leader, but also give you a lot of exposure to a lot of different things that you wouldn't normally see, or you can retool some of that knowledge that you have and apply it into other arenas in the military. So I know for myself, transitioning over into electronic warfare, like at 20 years in the Army, they were like, hey, you should go do EW. And I was like, okay, you guys were nuts. But then after having a conversation with a mentor of mine who was my HHC commander when I was a lieutenant, turned out he was an EW guy. He had gone from MI to electronic warfare. So again, he was able to take all his bona fides from being an intel officer for years and apply them into managing the electromagnetic spectrum, which is huge because that is a need that the Army needs. So understanding that is very, very important. You're focusing on leader development. Now, that's part of the reason why I do this podcast is just because it's like, hey, look, everybody is unique in their transition story. So getting out of the Army is always interesting stories. And the reason why they're always interesting is because I can take 1,000 military leaders, sit them in a room, and no 2 stories will be alike. And so that's why I like doing this podcast, because I understand that like we may have learned the same lessons in transition, but the way that you learn them versus the way that I learned them are going to be drastically different based off of perspective, location, what installation you were on, etc. But that's super cool. And then being able to have that type of influence that you had at the academy on the faculty is huge, because I think one of the things that we forget as leaders as you get longer into the military is you forget to continue to pursue learning. And the way that we've always done it, that briefs well, but doctrine is there for a reason because you are supposed to deviate from it. And I think that's one of the pieces of the discussions that's not very well learned until you actually have to do it. And so I really appreciate you being able to bring that kind of that knowledge to the faculty there, because again, the dynamics are changing, and the more dynamic we are as instructors, the more chance you're going to have it reaching more of your audience. You're not going to reach all of your audience, and that's one of the other things that is also frustrating as a leader sometimes, is like, hey, I can try, but I'm never going to hit 100%. But if I'm hitting underneath the bell curve, I'm doing a pretty good job. But thanks for the background. And like, so you said you retired in 2021. What was that? Why? Did you just find something else to do? Or were you just like, hey, I think I've hit, the pinnacle, or is the Army asking me to move on? Or have you just found another opportunity that was just as beneficial or rewarding?
Yeah, for me, I think it was ultimately that I had accomplished everything that I wanted to do. When I was originally picked up as an academy professor, I was picked up specifically to be the director of the Center for Junior Officers, and I always kind of envisioned that as the last job I was going to have in the Army, and I was comfortable with that, and I was fine with that. And then when this opportunity for the Chief of Faculty Development came along, I said, well, okay, sure, I'll do that. Absolutely, I'll take on that challenge. It sounds interesting. And after about a year or two in that job, as I kind of sat and looked at things and said, is this it for me? Is this the last job? Is there anything more that I want to do? And ultimately I said, no, I think I'm comfortable here. And there were really, I think, two additional things that fed into it. One was, I could see some people coming up the pipeline who I thought would be potentially great in the role. And so the timing was right for me to step aside and potentially clear a role. Now, I didn't get to pick my successor in the Army. We very rarely get to do that. So certainly I was kind of taking a chance in that opening that hole. I was trusting that the institution was going to find someone who's a good fit, and they ultimately did. And I'm super excited with the person they picked to fill that role. He's doing great things at West Point now. The other thing that was really interesting to me as I was reflecting and thinking about this, we encourage military folks to create this career timeline, right? This 3-year, 5-year, sometimes 10-year timeline, and you hear it all the time. But a lot of times when we encourage people to do that, we kind of push them to keep rolling it, right? To keep pushing the timeline farther and farther to the right. And we don't always encourage people to say, hey, think about at what point enough is enough for you. Think about at what point can you say, hey, I've gotten everything that I want to get out of this, and I think I'm done, and I think I'm ready to move on. And I think we don't always serve people well in that respect, because I think if we encourage more people to do that, to set a realistic point of, hey, this is where I'm done, and it's not just when the Army says I'm done, it's when I say I'm done. I think there would be people who would be leaving the Army kind of on better terms, or at least feeling better about their service, as opposed to, well, I guess it's time for me to go, so I'm out of here. So I was really fortunate in that I was able to kind of set the timing for my departure in that way, and I'm very grateful to my leaders, to my supervisors, for giving me the flexibility to do that.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, and this is something. So for all you junior military people listening to this, right, this is something that was brought up one time in a planning session with a guy who's much wiser than I am, General Brooks. So Vince Brooks said this in a meeting as we were in OIF, getting ready to turn it into Operation New Dawn. And he's like, one of the biggest problems that people have is knowing when to end their campaign. And so you as a strategist completely understand that, but even what you just mentioned is huge, because a lot of people are just flying by the seat of their pants, assignment to assignment, hoping that the next thing works out, rather than saying, hey, look, to put the military planner hat on, you got to have branches and sequels, right? So it's like, hey, look, if I get to this point, I'm going to do this. If I get to this point and I get log jammed, all right, what are my other options that I can take that are not going to be as painful as getting out? And that's one of the things that some people, it is a culture shock. And I know for me, it was very, very difficult because my old man was in the military. So when I walked across the stage in February of 2020, that was 46 years of being around the uniform. And I'm going, okay, like, wow, I'm actually a civilian now.
Wow.
So it was really took some growth in that transition. But the other piece of it is I didn't land too far away from, Fort Bragg and doing, government contract type work. So I'm close enough to help, but I'm far enough away where I don't get the 0300 alerts and have to come in, for the red Corvettes and all that craziness. So I'm happy with the balance that I have. But if I would have just continued to pursue, hey, let me get that next military assignment, that next military assignment, that next military assignment, I could still be in the Army right now, but I may not be happy, or I may not even be providing something that's as useful as what I'm doing outside. And that's one of the things that I had to tell people as part of your transition planning is, what are you going to do? What is going to give you that purpose once you take the uniform off? Because you can always help. There's tons of different veteran support organizations. There's tons of different charities that you can go into. You can start your own 501c if you wanted to. It takes about 5 years, but you could build something that could be just as beneficial to soldiers as, you did when you were in uniform. So all that being said, and speaking of building something, this is a great point to transition to is what are you doing now? Because you have an interesting background. I was kind of checking out the website a little bit, but I don't want to, make too many assumptions. I would rather have you tell me. So kind of, key us in and the audience on what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I had to make a decision when I left the Army. What was I going to do next? And thought about a couple different things. Potentially trying to get a civilian faculty job there at West Point. Maybe go teach somewhere else. And as I reflected and thought about the things that I enjoyed, I enjoyed teaching, but what really got me inspired and what really got me engaged was when I had the opportunity to work with faculty and help them develop things for their classroom. And at the same time, a lot of what I'd been doing while I was teaching, because West Point's a teaching institution, so even folks like me on the dean staff had a teaching responsibility. I was teaching history, and I did a lot of game-based learning in my classroom. I used a lot of, what we would call classroom simulations. Maybe it was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Maybe it was the Mongol invasion of Russia. Maybe it was the Russian Imperial Court. But I did a lot of that in my classroom because I felt like I saw the results. I saw how engaged it made cadets, and I saw how much deeper it got them into the material. And so I ultimately said, well, what if I could help faculty explore this idea of game-based learning and figure out a way that it works for them? Because there's a lot of literature out there about game-based learning. There's a lot out there about how it's a powerful tool, but for a lot of faculty, it can feel very unattainable. There's a really steep learning curve to getting into it. There's concerns about whether your institution is going to take you seriously or not. So there's a lot of barriers to game-based learning. And so that's what I did. I set up an educational games coaching company called 42 Educational Games Coaching and Design. And what I do is I work with undergraduate faculty who want to implement game-based learning in their classroom, but have absolutely no idea how to do so. And basically, for the cost of what your average faculty member pays to go to an annual conference, right? So that money is already there. It's already set aside for your faculty development. You're just redirecting it in a different way. For what a typical faculty member pays for in order to go to a conference, I will help that faculty member find a game that works for their classroom and make whatever tweaks are necessary for it to work and really work perfectly in that classroom without any further effort on the part of the faculty member. I've been doing this now for a little over a year and am just really enjoying it, having a great time. I've gotten to work with faculty all over the country. I've even gotten to help folks edit their own games. Folks who were working on games and needed help, I've been able to help give them a push on that as well. So really, it has panned out better than I had hoped, and I've certainly had great opportunities to engage folks, and looking forward to more of the same.
Yeah, and that's awesome because I can remember way back in the day, and I'm sure you do too, the tactical decision games. So tactical decision games, not as the same level of intensity because, again, there's fewer variables, right? So I just have a platoon going on to this objective. But when you start talking about, the Punic Wars, or you start talking about, Russia invading, Georgia in 2014, you have a much broader scope because you have international considerations and all that. Ultimately, what it boils down to, it's an old poli-sci lesson that we learned in high school that we don't talk about until recently, the whole instruments of power and understanding how those things work and how to manipulate the situation in your favor. And the best way, like using the game is the best way of doing it because you already know the results. So then you can present, hey, look, various different arguments underneath the construct of that situation. And then you have the approved solution, and the approved solution only is because of history, like, hey, look, this is what actually happened versus, great idea. I would have never thought to do X, Y, or Z, or moving that carrier strike group was the right idea at the time. Or, hey, what happens if you don't have flyover rights? So there's a whole bunch of different variables that strategically come into play. And if you look at the last 20 years of dealing with, Iraq and Afghanistan, and now looking at Taiwan and Ukraine, the problem sets are similar, right? So everybody's like, oh, we should be able to easily defend Taiwan. Not if we don't have overflight. Very, very similar to going into Iraq the first time. Like, we don't have an overflight of countries that are willing to support, air operations, regardless of what it is. It could hinder the ability for the U.S. to actually project combat power in a timely manner. Doesn't mean that it won't get there. It just takes longer. And so being able to consider those things pre-hostilities and start thinking about those problems before, we start launching soldiers into a meat grinder, it helps. And that a future generation of officers is thinking about this, and now the faculty is thinking about how to train those officers how to think that way. I think this is another great tool of being able to plan and engage, because as much as nobody likes to be part of a joint planning team, like, most of the heavy lifting within your division, outside of the ops floor, is in the J35, and those guys are banging their head against the wall. And then, the G5 guys are thinking, well, how do we get them back after all this stuff goes haywire? So I completely understand how gaming is important. So as part of getting this all set up, what was the hardest thing that you kind of encountered as you were building out your new business and trying to get traction with this unique idea? Because from an educational standpoint, I could probably see a lot of resistance to this, as we were talking before we really got started. This isn't the way that we did it last year. Can be a very terrible pitfall, particularly in education. So how was actually presenting this to faculty? How was that? Was it well received? And how is that going is basically what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, so the really interesting thing is that for the most part, faculty have actually received it reasonably well. They've thought about it and said, "Oh, okay, that makes sense." Even if say, "I'm not sure it's for me, but I can think about X person that might be a good fit or might be a good connection." It certainly helps that there is a huge body of evidence-based literature that is out there that points to the benefits of game-based learning, that talks about how well it works in a bunch of different contexts. So winning over faculty has not been as difficult as I anticipated. The big challenge that I really struggled with up front, honestly, was how to price my services. This is a skill that we just, as service members, we never develop, right? The cost of our labor is set by external forces, right? It's set by act of Congress. It's set by whatever the annual pay rates are. Maybe if you're fortunate enough to be drawing flight pay or jump pay or one of these other special pays, then the price of your labor is a little bit higher. But it's all externally driven. You really, as a soldier, you really don't have a voice in what your pay rate is. Now, all of a sudden, I'm setting up this business, which is pretty different than most of what's out there. And I have to decide what's an appropriate pay rate, right? What is appropriate for asking for that? And when you've never done that before, it can feel very uncomfortable, right? It can feel very mercenary, very, well, I'm clearly just out for the money because I'm asking for X amount. And so you really do have to sit back and say, no, the service that I'm providing is a valuable service. I wouldn't be doing it otherwise, and people wouldn't be asking me to do it. So let's go out and look at some comparable things. Let's look at some comparable professions and see if we can find what is, a reasonable hourly based rate or a job based rate. And it really took me a solid 2 or 3 months to kind of hash through as I was starting to take on work, to really hash through what my hourly rate, what my job rate was going to be.
Yeah, that pricing order of magnitude is very, very difficult. And a lot of people, like you said, don't think about it because there's kind of two buckets too, right? So if it's a product that I'm providing, how much does that product cost? If it's a service that I'm providing, products and services kind of go in one bin. And then what's your rate as a consultant? So like, hey, look, you already have something set up. So how do I come in and just assist you to advance whatever your outcome is? And there's a lot of money to be made in those situations. But again, it goes back to, one, having the confidence in yourself to charge the rate that you're charging and then being able to deliver. And I think that's one of the difficulties of the interview process, particularly when, somebody's been in the Army 20, 25 years and they go, hey, what do you think your salary should be? And most guys are like pulling up their LES and going, well, I guess it needs to be something around this, right? And that doesn't actually mean that that's accurate compared to the job that they're doing. Like a director in the Army is probably getting paid 75 to 100K less than a director in a program for a larger corporation. So you got to have to be able to, scale it by comparison to where you're going and then what service you're providing. But I think that's pretty tremendous point of discussion. I appreciate you bringing it up because I know a lot of people, like freeze when that question is asked. The safest thing to do, and this is just a piece of advice from me, but like if you're not sure what your rate should be, it should be somewhere between your base pay in the Army plus entitlements and about 10 to 15%. So give them that range. So if you can give them that range and say, hey, look, I need between 100 and 130K, right? So that gives them some flexibility. But the other part of it is it shows that you thought about it, but it still puts the decision on the hiring person and the HR person to kind of make that final decision. And if they're feeling it, they might give you the higher end. If they're not, they'll give you the lower end, but at least you have something that you're comfortable with that doesn't put you in a position where you have to work, because you got to keep your lights on. And so that's a very, very important thing. But I'm going to ask one last question and then we'll get you out of here. But Ray, we really appreciate you coming on. This has been great, super rich discussion. I'm going to have to dig more into your product because I think it's very, very interesting. And the reason why I say that is because, trying to teach innovation to senior leaders in the military is a very, very difficult thing to do. Everybody has buzzwords, right? So if you were to walk into any division headquarters in the Army, they're talking artificial intelligence, machine learning. We want drones. We want AI. We want big data. I want cloud services. I want all this stuff. I want JADC2, blah, 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 blah. Like there's a litany of, of acronyms, but at no point we're like, okay, sir, well, what is driving you to make that decision? Well, it's because the Army is saying that I have to, or it came out in a presidential notification. Well, that doesn't help. That's not a thought process. That's guidance, And so it's developing those iterations of training that need to happen in the underpinnings. But the last question that I'll ask you before we get out of here is, was there a tool, book, program, something that you used during your transition that made it difficult or easy, or I would say not as difficult, or something that you wish that the listeners would know about because it helped you kind of land where you're working today?
Yeah, since I knew that I wanted to set up a small business, I decided that I was going to milk the SFL TAP program for all that it was worth. So yeah, I did the week-long course that everybody does, but then I heard about the entrepreneurship track that comes off of that. It's a 2 or 3 day track depending on where you're located. And let me just tell you, if you are coming out of the military and you're looking to set up a small business, that entrepreneurship track is worth its weight in gold. I did not have high expectations going into it, and I was blown away by how good it was. I appreciated how grounded the materials were. They did a great job of talking about, hey, maybe you're just going to set up a small sole proprietor LLC like mine. Maybe you're going to try and set up a B Corp or a C Corp. Great. Here are the tools that you're going to need to do that. And then they connect you with all different kinds of resources. One that I jumped on that to this day I'm referencing is there's a Mississippi State Business Certificate program that basically walks you through the process of building your business plan, start to finish. So you will probably come into this certificate program with kind of a half-baked idea of here's what I think I want to do. In 8 weeks, they will walk you through the building of your business plan and give you detailed critiques along the way, not only from their top flight business faculty, but also your peers who are also going through this program. It's 8 weeks. I think it was 2 hours a week, maybe 3 hours a week. So it wasn't, in terms of time demand, not bad at all. And again, I walked away from that certificate program with a business plan that I still use and refer to this day. So that SFL TAP entrepreneurship track and its resources, fantastic. And if you're looking at going into business out of the military, I can't recommend that track enough.
Yeah, that's a good note. And one of the other things that I would toss in there as well, like, hey, look, it's never too early to start your own LLC, right? Most filings, depending on what state you're in, between $200 and $400. So if you're thinking about being an entrepreneur at some point in the military, go ahead and do it now, because you'll spend a lot less time, energy, and effort like setting it up today with all the other services that are available to assist than in panic mode when you're trying to figure out how I'm going to pay my power bill in the next 6 months, right? So create the opportunity for yourself early. It's time value of money. So if you can invest today, it's going to be worth more 10 years from now than it will be in extremis 10 years from now. So I would encourage everybody, even if it's just a small LLC, to cover, your wife's online Etsy store or whatever that you're doing, whatever it is. I don't care what it is, but create that LLC so you have the opportunity to shelter away some cash, use this, separate employee pension plan. There's other ways that you can also shelter money in that to give you more of a tax break, even though you get a lot of tax breaks while you're in the uniform. So again, start your own business. SFL TAP entrepreneurship track. I think you're one of the first people. I know you're the first person that's actually recommended that. I've heard of some other ones that are nonprofit or VSO based, but I've never heard of, specifically taking that track during SFL TAP. So that's a great nugget to take with us. Yeah, I really appreciate this, Ray. This was awesome. Like, I love doing these because, again, I learn something new every time, and I really, really appreciate it. And hey, look, if you guys are not a fan of Army football, then at least check out the College Football Roundtable. As for football, if not, if you're an Army fan, join the Firsty Club. Listen to the As for Football Army Football show. That's how Ray and I got linked up. But either way, great conversation. I really, really appreciate you coming on today. And this has been Rob Robinson with Philosophy from the Frontline. And for myself and Ray Kimball, we will see you guys on the high ground. Thanks. Thanks for listening to Philosophy from the Frontline with Rob Robinson. We will bring you more interesting veteran transition stories, veteran advocacy, and more information in veterans transition in general on a podcast platform near you. This is Philosophy from the Frontline, and we'll see you on the high ground. Thanks.